Good afternoon, everyone. So we'll be together until 4:30, 4:45 to address the third part of this conference on insurability of the natural risks, of the climate risk. We'll be talking about natural disasters. We'll be also talking about management of crisis, lack of coverage, as well as preventing risks, and potential solutions that insurers and public powers could introduce in order to address these various issues. Now, with me to dig deeper into these issues, we have eminent speakers whom you all know very well, but I would like to introduce them. Jean-Laurent Granier, who is the chairman and CEO of Generali for France. Bernard Delas, who is vice chair of the French ACPR authority. We have Philippe Gustin, who is a prefect and the Interministerial Delegate for the Reconstruction work for the Caribbean islands of French Saint-Barthélemy and Saint-Martin. He's the prefect of the Guadeloupe region. There's an empty chair for Jean Jouzel, who is a climatologist, who is Emeritus Research Director with the French Research Center, CEA, and two other speakers, in fact, were scheduled to our session, but will not come. There was a lady speaker who could not come at very short notice, so she couldn't be replaced, which is why we don't have a lady speaker. So Jean Jouzel, Emeritus Research Director with CEA, has just joined us. And the second person who will not be with us is the European Commissioner for Environment, Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, Mr. Karmenu Vella, who couldn't be with us today, but who recorded an introductory video, and I suggest we watch it now. Video now.
It is your job to read the future, to weigh up the evidence and see where the wind blows. And you know, it's not smooth sailing. Climate change is not a risk, it's our current reality, bringing heat waves and storms, droughts and floods, the like of which we have never seen before. And there are many more challenges that threaten our future: pollution and biodiversity loss, illegal fishing, overconsumption of natural materials, challenges that jeopardize progress towards sustainable development all around the world. But as insurers, you don't just ponder the future, you help to create it. In Europe, insurance companies are one of the biggest sources of private sector finance. Your contribution can make an enormous difference. It's in your power to make big changes, to shape our common future. You can help close the investment gap for the transition to a more sustainable economy. You can help because you understand sustainability. You know that it is the bedrock of long-term success. Voluntary commitments here have a huge potential. When a company like AXA bans insurance for vessels involved in illegal fishing, it sends a very powerful signal. When large insurers choose to steer capital towards greener assets, they create a virtuous circle. Many of you are making that change because it is good business sense. At the European Commission, we are doing what we can to spread that message. That is why we adopted an action plan on financing sustainable growth in March. We want to ensure that capital is flowing towards sustainable investments. We want to focus attention on risks from climate change, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. And we want a drive towards greater transparency and concern for the longer term. So my message to you is very simple. I want you to use your power to good effect. Lock us into sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, and resource-efficient technologies. It is in your power to help safeguard our future. You are everybody's insurance. Thank you.
Vous pouvez effectivement applaudir le commissaire Vella et on peut le remercier pour...
You can, sorry, give a big hand to Commissioner Vella. We can thank him for setting the stage with all these issues and with the backdrop of climate change and the required measures to be taken to counter this climatic deregulation under development. And you will notice that he reminded us all of the various contributions expected from insurance companies with respect to sustainability and the response to climate change. We will have the opportunity to pick up on some of the points he's made. But before we look into solutions, I would like us to go over some contextual aspects. Some 10 days ago in the Aude region in southern France, we had dramatic events which has been engaging the public powers and insurance companies to respond to these natural disasters. It's not a one-off event. It follows such natural events of almost similar magnitude which have happened in France since the beginning of the year, and it follows 2017, which was really a disaster-rich year for France and for regions in the world. Last year, we beat a number of records. More than 180 natural disasters were recorded. Some 290 billion euros were generated as environmental damage, even though the human fatalities were and the wounded were came in more limited numbers and volumes. Among these natural disasters, you had the Irma hurricane and the Maria hurricane as well, which affected the French Caribbean, which we will use as an example to dig into our first topic, which is how you manage a crisis of the kind of a natural disaster. So I will naturally turn to you, Mr. Philippe Gustin, as a French prefect for the Caribbean regions. This disaster struck the Caribbean islands a year ago. In a nutshell, can you tell us about your experience and what lessons you can draw from the way the disaster was managed and responded to? And later on in our session, we'll look into the reconstruction work. But with respect to crisis management, with some hindsight, can you tell us what your experience has been? Well, on the 11th of September 2017, I was putting on my sneakers in the local gym when my phone rang. It was the chief of staff of the French President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, who asked me whether I could be interested in this position as an interministerial delegate for the reconstruction work for the islands of Saint-Barthélemy and Saint-Martin. I said yes immediately, and 7 hours later, I was flying jointly with the French Republic President, jointly with Bernard Smith, going to the Saint-Martin and Saint-Barthélemy Islands. Lots was said about this disaster. The first images which impressed me when I landed on the islands was an island in ruin. Everything was gray, no green left. Usually these islands are flush with Greenland, and we immediately realized the human disasters. There were people who wanted to escape the island, flooding the airport, and very quickly, so I stayed there. I didn't go back immediately to metropolitan France, and as I stayed on the island, I realized that whereas our fellow Caribbean citizens from Saint-Martin and Saint-Barthélemy showed great resilience because they are accustomed to these disasters. But such disaster, 375 kilometers an hour wind, is basically the like of a TGV train running you over. You know, how can you accommodate such a powerful force? So there are people I meet with today, yet in Saint-Martin have seen death with their own eyes, and 11 fatalities were were recorded, but all of them had the impression that they might die. What struck me immediately is, whereas you might accept natural disasters, especially when you live and work on islands like those where you have regular disasters, you cannot accept that you have a crisis piling up on the natural crisis. People can accept natural disasters because there's not much you can do against natural forces, but you cannot accept being deprived from water supply, power, grid, and telecom connections. They could not accept that on the day after there was ransacking and looting because there was no power, there was no communication means, there was no telecom connections, and a human and social and societal crisis added to the natural disaster. Now, I could speak about this for hours, but I need to be concise. There were basically several stages. The first was the spontaneous immediate stage just after the crisis. And you need to be aware that the island has 35,000 inhabitants. This is the official count. We had up to 3,500 volunteers and private and professional volunteers working on the ground. That is one volunteer out of 10 locals. So number two, we implemented, and this will have an impact on the way insurers responded. We have a double factor. There are two islands which are connected with the Guadeloupe island, which is a larger island, and you can't transit directly from these two small islands directly to the other bigger islands. So we were cut from the rest of the world. No telecom, no telephone left, and we are not able to travel to this other French territory that was the Guadeloupe island. So there was unprecedented engagement, including an air bridge set up by the air forces to provide food and water to people. It's hard to imagine in the 21st century, but basically this was the situation. You had people queuing up to get their supply of water and food, and this lasted for about so power was restored on the 27th of September, but Irma hurricane struck on the 6th of September, so 21 days after. Telecom connections for mobile phones was restored around the 20th of October, and water supply was restored on the 1st of January. If you compare the situation with the Puerto Rico island, so 13 months after Maria, the power supply has not been fully restored across the Puerto Rico island. So we didn't do so bad on this French territory. So we activated the crisis unit of the French prefecture, which grouped together all of the rescue services and emergency services, as well as law enforcement services. Then we came into phase two, which was not yet reconstruction work, but this kind of intermediary phase between January and May, when we had to redress and repair all the things which went wrong. Thank you, Mr. Prefect. I'm turning to you, Jean-Laurent.
Generali is a very active insurer in the French overseas countries and in the West Indies. So again, as seen from the insurer, what was your experience in managing the crisis? I know it was a bit tough earlier on. There was difficulty in accessing. Even the teams who were there on the spot were hit by that event. Yes, absolutely. Good afternoon to everyone. That experience was quite painful because we are dedicated to our activities in the West Indies. We are one of the two largest local insurers there. We have 24% market share in the West Indies and 30% in Saint Martin. And we were initially at Martinique, so we had issues with communication and access. Our first concern was to make sure that our staff was out of danger and could take care of their families. Once that was resolved, we wanted to make sure everyone was up and working and do our best. What we had to do, which was to be close to our policyholders, you know, in a context which was absolutely awful, as Prefect Gustin has just reminded us. So a few factors here. For us, out of about 12,000 policyholders there, we had 7,000 claims. So it was most of our policyholders who were hurt. And it represented 2017 over 18 months. Our small company there, well, 2017 was not over 12 months, but over 18 months. So we had to swallow up 18 months of work. In other words, our staff members worked during the weekend. The teams in France strengthened them. So in the Martinique, Guadeloupe, we had to forget about them a little bit to focus on that island. So we just focused on that crisis. Of course, there were sent corporate teams, and we supported also from a distance through Skype and so on. When it was reestablished, we tried to move as swiftly as possible. You know, the demand from the population was to feel the presence of their insurers. So we went very quickly there. Now 98 or 99% of our policyholders have received funds from us. We haven't settled 100% of the claims. Why? Well, because in 30% of cases, we had no piece of information helping us to pay, especially if there's co-ownership of certain estates. It was tough. So for 30%, they're still in a situation which is a bit confusing. And we faced also situations of human distress, but also of people who tried to take advantage of this, which had nothing to do with support. The cost of repairs and of the construction is already high in these territories. So what we noticed, however, is a 20% extra cost, which was paid by the insurers and by the policyholders. So so this is part, of course, of the problems, and I'm sure that the prefect will mention this, which we face in this kind of situation in these territories where there's a real challenge in terms of managing crisis. Solidarity plays into play in the insurance business. And it allows us to continue as an insurer and with a company dedicated to these territories in the West Indies. It helps us stay there, and we want to do our mission very well. It strengthened our conviction in three fields. First of all, we need to know better the natural risks, the way they can hit the territories we insure. And here I would be eager to listen about how things are evolving today. For us, it's important to invest in knowledge, and we are developing at Generali an R&D on this topic about knowing better natural risk. We need also quality data to know ahead of time how our risk exposure changes. And in the West Indies, we'll have geolocalized 100% the risk that we insure, which is an absolute necessity. And lastly, we need to differentiate our approaches depending on the nature of the risk. And then we are facing to this question of weather changes and being exposed to natural elements. We need to take into account three dimensions which are combined and increase the complexity. First of all, the unexpected events, and secondly, there's something specific to the territory which can be more or less exposed to certain types of natural risk. Like there are some tornadoes. We can talk about also some extremely dry weather. We could talk about earthquakes. The territory in itself is an element. And finally, also the goods to be insured are also an element on the risk, and it's essential that we invest more understanding and recommendations to make to our policyholders. I'll come back to this later on. You were speaking about local specificities in relation to unexpected events. Now, in the management of crisis and in the compensation process, were there any unique elements related to the venue or to the violence of the event? You talked about co-ownerships of estates. Did you encounter other difficulties? Where two difficulties were quite plain. People talk to the insurers, and we do our best. First of all, we need to appraise things, and there was a lack of experts for us and appraisers. And there's something else which is basic. You need construction equipment and reconstruction equipment. And to start, even if you give money, it doesn't give you a room. we had a shortage of cement, sand, and we had to supply that. So materially speaking, even if you had teams that were moving around locally, we had mobile antennas.
La capacité à
Once you have the ability to provide financial means, you also want to have physical and material means, and this is the first limit we faced. And now that with the benefit of hindsight, and if that kind of event were now to occur again in other territories, are there any takeaways for you from this experience in order to better next time? Look, I can give you an example immediately, which is what we did as part of LOD. We have a partnership with a company, Predict, with 4 different levels of alerts. Now, as part of the so-called LOD events, just on the eve of the events, we send to our policyholders on 36 or 37,000 texts, which were sent to these policyholders with different levels of alerts, so that there are a number of our policyholders out of the 200 most exposed communities. We told them take shelter high up on the hills or in the mountains. So some journalists who inquired there were surprised to see that some people who were exposed told them that we were forewarned by our insurer and that it was important to take shelter. And why was that the case? I was talking about GPSs of risk. We now work not only in departments but within communities. We want to take a step further in terms of the fine perception of the nature of risk, and this is essential. Mr. Prefect, the population locally was able to express a lack of patience, a lack of understanding, especially with respect to the compensation of goods. I don't want to raise a controversy here, but how do you, as seen from a distance, do you assess the role and the action of insurers in terms of crisis management, and what about the cooperation between the public authorities and the insurer in managing this crisis at Saint-Barthélemy and Saint-Martin? Anyone who has managed this kind of crisis, first of all, and that's my business, sorry for that, once the surprise is gone, you look for those who are responsible. We look for scapegoats. And in general, it's quite easy to find scapegoats. The person who's always responsible or liable is the state, regardless. Even if they have nothing to do with this, then they need to find other heads to cut off. The insurers, the Fondation de France, all these people who normally should have played a role, which were to improve the situation and didn't do it quickly enough, were very quickly turned into the culprit. Look, this is not an ordinary territory. This is something that we had ascertained in common. As I wrote, and I will repeat it, actually Irma was just revealed malfunctionings that existed on those territories. That in those territories, especially in the case of standards of the urban area, I mean, for many, many years, the standards were not up to par. So these data are quite important. The St. Martin's population was multiplied between 1982 to 2000. So this is the outcome of something very straightforward, which is no taxes or lower taxes. We had lower taxes that were developed on this territory with one single will to have a maximum profitability. So it was they built with materials that were very normal, that did not take into account the strong standards to prevent tornadoes, and they were built on territories where it shouldn't have been built. The land, I'm being recorded here, right? So the land has many limitations and constraints, and one key factor, in order to make a maximum of profit, these tax-free programs, they had these programs built by people who were coming from the surrounding islands, who were exploited and who did not leave once the programs were over. And these people went where the local inhabitants never went. And they built there with whatever they had on hand. So therefore, the population, with 44% of the inhabitants at Saint Martin, were born foreign and in a foreign land. And they no longer have the sense of reality and the culture of risk. And with one last unique features, these two islands in the Republic, which are the closest to the United States, with a way of looking at risk and of risk insurance, which is very American. Very concretely, you just fall and get back on your feet. But you're French, but then you want the state to help you be back on your feet. So at the end of the day, together, we experienced a support or engagement, which is a reality, not only to settle issues in all full transparency. I told Bernard and his teams, we need to communicate, and say what you do. Others will speak for you. And one key factor, only 40% of estate owners had insurance. In other words, 60% were uninsured. And it's very often the uninsured who were very vociferous and were blaming. And so it's important to explain things with the risk of being accused. But today, anyway, cooperation needs to go further down the road for the reconstruction, making sure in the future that these territories become more resilient against their own will, in a way, because it's not spontaneous and it's not even natural. So today, we need to build and rebuild a territory. I always use examples. 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference in Martinique. There was an American guest speaker who explained for €1 invested in order to improve the resilience of a building, it's €7 of saved once the risk is past, is gone. It's a purely economical factor, but you need to repeat this again and again, otherwise the risk, and this is what is taking place, by the way, unfortunately, there's a will for the people, the inhabitants of Saint Martin, to rebuild and do as if nothing had happened before. So we must absolutely today, together, work towards this change in habits. And you gave the example of load, and I also tracked this in 1999 because we used to look at this. I was the deputy prefect there. I had the same issues at the time. So I think in 1999, what was difficult to have people accept in the load is that people no longer rebuild in places which obviously were at risk and at the repeated risk. And today, I think people are ready. It's mature. We'll see what happens after this disaster. We are not at this level in Saint Martin nor in the West Indies, where, you know, the last tornado there was with 27 years ago. The risk culture had totally vanished into thin air. On the contrary, because the last element, which is key here, I think we are also living in a society where men think that they are smarter than nature, and where we keep saying that we can protect against everything because of technical progress and make sure there's no cancer. People think that, they think that techniques can repair anything, except that techniques will never succeed in countering nature, and this is difficult to convey into the minds of people. You were saying that the risk culture, the memory of risk had disappeared on these islands, even though the last tornado was not so far away in history. Does it mean that we should take example on Japan, where there's this kind of education right from the earlier age with adults, and where they repeat things again and again, how to react if there is a tornado or a hurricane? You have read everything I've written on this topic, right? Yes, I advocate this in Guadeloupe and Saint Martin. I will be putting into place these so-called Japanese events. We during one day we redefine all the various processes for every kind of risk, not only about hurricanes. No, it's not difficult in the West Indies. You have every risk except snow, although there could be such a case at La Soufrière. So we have to brace ourselves for this. There's another key factor here, which you find among the clients you have, especially those that were the most vociferous, and very often people who left France to settle down on these islands in Saint Martin. They came with a clear idea they were going to paradise. They were never explained that they were also going to hell. This was hell there, and in particular, I've seen it with my own eyes. In these, they were, you know, there were some of these people had nothing in their fridges, because when you need something, you just go to the supermarket, you buy a kilo of rice and so on, and just the concept of preparing yourself, of having a minimum of food for 3 days and have water, electricity. This is not that is natural for them, because this is not something they're used to on their islands. So that risk culture has to be put in the minds of people. And Bernard, you've noticed it if you look at the population, the people who were at the airport of Rancas and wanted to leave the island. It was about 95% of them were these people who were escaping from a territory where they had the impression, and they never came back, by the way. There are 8,000 who left the territory after all, and they really had the impression that they had been flouted, that we were told that it was paradise. Well, it was hell. So you see that risk culture has to be prepared. That Japanese day, which I want to put in Saint Martin, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Barthélemy, will not only check that all processes are in place, and secondly, have also debates with the citizens on this issue, because this matter, and my neighbor will not contradict me, this is changing constantly, and science and watching and the feedback helps us. Men are always weaker than nature, but sometimes they can display some smartness. So it's important to work on this and come up with responses. So it's important to have these debates with the citizens to tackle all these risk-related issues.
Now you mentioned risk management, short-term risk management, to really learn how to behave during the crisis. And you also, how about the long-term dimension of risk management? Well, you also mentioned this, and this leads me to the second topic we'd like us to talk about. In other words, the tie-in between those natural disasters and climate change. And I'm turning to you, Jean, and find out, and we'll take stock of the scientific situation here. In other words, this tie-in between global change and natural disasters. And perhaps you'll want to say a few words on the very last report that was drawn up. Well, perhaps we'll keep it for the very end of the presentation. Hello, Bertrand. Hello, everybody. Yes, I would like to bring good tidings rather than bad tidings. This is not necessarily the case. And the first point that we need to shed light on is that those extreme situations which we just talked about, which Philippe Gustin talked about, and which we mentioned also when we referred to the Aude department and Saint-Martin and the West Indies. Well, those extreme situations have already existed even before global change. So let's bear this in mind. Even though without a global change, now we need to take population increase into consideration and really be aware of those risks. And it is quite important to really dwell upon it. And the question that we are actually raising, and we're providing a few answers here, how about those extreme events, their intensity, their frequency? Now, are they impacted by global change? This is a question. And I would tend to say that we are now the climate we're now experiencing is the one which our community had anticipated 20 to 30 years ago, an average increase 1 to 2/10 of a degree, accompanied with the intensification of extreme events, and this is what we're experiencing today. And the scientific community seems to have been facing up to temperature increases through IPCC and the entire community, and we need to really take 2050 very seriously. So this is the underlying message. Let's have a look at the tornadoes. Now, tornadoes, hurricanes. Now, it just so happens that in the region, in other words, the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean, those cyclones, hurricanes, are getting stronger, and we can see a further development among those hurricanes. This is not necessarily true in other parts of the planet, but in the northern part of the Atlantic, this is the case. And records have been beaten, have been reached with Irma, but we got figures in global change, uncontrolled global change, 3 to 4 degrees increase by the end of the 21st century, which is still possible, unfortunately. And the increased intensity of those hurricanes, I mean, underlying mechanisms. Well, okay, they make sense at the very beginning. Now, the energy inside a hurricane stems from water condensation and steam condensation, and the warmer the ocean, the more evaporation takes place. You get a whole series of other factors such as shearing. But first of all, the amount of water vapor and steam actually is behind the energy and violence of those hurricanes. And when this energy is unleashed, well, you get what you see. Now, how it happens is a little more complicated. So the figures generated by the last IPCC report, now those maximum velocities are increasing up to 10% or by 10% versus the already observed velocities, and the increased amount of rainfall in the aftermath of the hurricanes by 20%. Now, this is bad news because we got 3 problems with those hurricanes on the brink of the ocean and on the shore. And, you build houses, and this is like you tinker it up, shit shacks, and then you got a problem. You got winds also, and a rainfall, perhaps less in Saint-Martin and St. Martin, but have a look at what happened at Houston, for example. So those are 3 items which are destructive parameters, and when you got those 3 parameters associated with one another on the shore, this does generate quite important damage. So the answer is yes. Yes, we are fearing more important risks related to intense hurricanes, strong hurricanes. Now, in important global change, we'd be talking about 2-degree increase in temperature levels. And this is unfortunately true with what happened in the Eau department when talking about the Mediterranean events. The situation is identical. Now, quite a number are talking about this when having a look at the French weather report data to 2014, for example. Globally speaking, we don't really see any intensification of Mediterranean events. Now, we talk about Zevnol events, but let's have a look at recent years, for example. The last statistical figures show that changes have occurred, and the mechanisms are somewhat similar. In other words, the warming of the Mediterranean Sea might generate more intense risks, rainfall, more intense rainfall, and as a result, in both cases anyway, those are really genuine problems. And let me just add, go on with droughts. The southeastern part of France is doubly punished because drought, less rainfall, and all of a sudden more intense rainfall stemming from the Mediterranean process. So this is how this is being described. And the last point, now the heat waves that are also getting more intense. So let me get back to what Philippe Gustin just referred to. This Claudel, I mean, this is my main criticism. He's not being skeptical. That's his right, actually. I mean, the repairing ecology, this is what you referred to, Philippe. In other words, people think they're stronger than nature and believe that when the catastrophes are going to be getting hold of us, we'll be able to battle them. No, nobody is going to be able to battle the increased levels of the season. Nobody is going to be able to stop this. So this repairing ecology is extremely dangerous, and this is actually the underlying idea. Will always be able to overcome the catastrophes. Well, the answer is no, and that's the reason why we need to adapt, and we need to prevent education. All this has to be at the core, and I really agree with you. We need to have the service culture. I got back from FMC, and we were talking about, we talked about ode for 45 minutes. She's we talked with an hydrologist, and all this is important. We really need to gauge the situation, and let's not believe that we're gonna be stronger than nature. And this is a problem. There are no good news here, but the good news actually right now is number one. Of course, we'll be talking about the curbing of global warming. If we do nothing at all, then no problem. But the good news is that people are now aware. We're getting aware of this. And mayors and city authorities, there are possibilities to adjust ourselves in a smart way and really keep living in those regions that might be subject to drought, to the floods or Saint-Martin. I had a question to Philippe Gustin. So anyway, I worked on climate justice related issues, and that says also with Agnès Michelot. She's a legal expert, and the first consequence of global warming is increased inequalities. And the question I'd like to ask you, Philippe, I got the feeling now the Saint-Martin, I mean, the poor population was less prepared to that event, and they really are having a hard time to reel from this, more so than others. Am I right to say that? Perhaps the answer is no. Now, this is paradoxical an issue. Now, the poor people are self-repair is something they're pretty good at. So they were the first ones who really be subject to this. Now, on satellite photos, I mean, the roofs actually fell on their heads because they actually tinkered up their houses. But we've been following up on those photos since the 3rd of September after Irma. Now, the most disenfranchised neighborhoods and the most vulnerable neighbors, as I said, I mean, those people actually settled in that area. And they actually, no, they had covered roofs, actually, corrugated steel roofs, and they had, been using this. I mean, this is just like the tarnished layer here, or the varnish part. When we lost roof culture, but the old St. Martin people did not put steel in their roofs, and when they did use corrugated steel, the people would actually use screws, and in hurricane seasons, they really strap those roofs and strengthen the roofs. And now people are using nails instead of screws now. That's what the economic system is all about. And we can actually observe, along with the insurance companies, I mean, what else is new? I mean, those people, unfortunately, are used to those vulnerable situations or this vulnerability. But those same corrugated steels had impacts on others and generated further damage because the process is, I mean, we were able to model up the process. Those steels actually open up, and the wind gets inside, and the roof just opens up just like a tin box. So this is the first point. So they do. So this was a paradox, and the other side of the coin here is those people have no other alternative. They have to stay there, and at the end of the day, I actually gave 150 interviews since the beginning of my mission, and a journalist has always, they always ask me the same question, but what do you do for those people that have no insurance policy, and those people without insurance policy? Well, they've been accumulating, stacking things up. In other words, they got no rights or titles in highly vulnerable regions. So what do you do? What is the state doing for those people? So I gave an answer. I said that I was lucky or unlucky to have lived in a communist state, and I knew what the state was able to do, and this was quite daunting. Be that as it may, national mutual support and what can the public sector can do, we are reaching limits and equity limits, actually, and now, those people that did everything, did everything squeaky clean, his owner, he's got an insurance policy, and he used all the rights and so on and so forth, would not be supported as much as the other people. So the whole system is actually made unaccountable for, and this is quite complicated because those populations remain extremely vulnerable, and only one solution prevails here, and this is quite complicated, a solution. In other words, move those people from one place to the other, and that island is actually the size of half of Paris and 3/4 of the land. There is just totally uninhabitable. So you see how challenging it is. The population depends on tourism, and there again, responsibilities are quite shared. I mean, some basic mistakes were made at all levels, even at the governmental level. Now, the urban legal situation was totally crazy, but also the professionals are also responsible. Architects were not able to hold out against the fad, the fashion. People were telling them, that's when we were on the shore, we need... We want no frame at all. We want to have a view over the sea. Even in the toilets, we need to have a view over the ocean. Now, the problem is the water gets in very easily. So, when I started out with a mission in Saint-Barthélemy 14 months ago, I tried to meet up with quite a number of experts, and I'm not going to mention his name, but one of them told me, hey, Mr. Prefect, you want no risks? Okay, 35,000 inhabitants on a barge from St. Martin should be taken back, not to Guadeloupe, because, well, actually take them back to France, and let's actually place them in the Massif Central. Now, this is called the climatic refugee concept. And we'll just have to manage this problem on the global, international level, because this also generates crises and tensions, and we see this in Europe. And by just pulling the string, we actually unravel the situation. We face up to very complex realities. We're going to tackle this insurability related issue. And you were referring to the fact that people are made unaccountable. Let me get back to the tie-in between climate change and natural disasters. And Jean-Laurent asked you the following question. At Generali, for example, in this sector, did you try to anticipate the future predictable evolution of the intensity and frequency of natural disasters, most especially in the global change context, which is highly well documented by the scientific community? Yes, of course, this is something which is a great source of concern to us, not only in our profession, but at CPA, for example. Delas will also talk about it. At first, the initial study had been conducted in 2014-2015, saying that basically in the next 25 years, the accumulated disasters related to global warming would be double that of the previous 25 years and should be reaching close to 100 billion euros versus 48 in the previous years. This hypothesis is probably underestimated because at the time, the hypotheses, global warming related hypotheses, were lower than the actual current hypotheses, and the observations made on the increased number of very violent and very local events is in the Eau department, and the repetitive aspect of those events. Well, actually, acceleration is more of an operative word than the hypotheses made at the time. What needs to be underscored in this analysis when observing the financial damages and the property damage generated by natural disasters, well, 30 to 40% of the increase will be stemming from the higher intensity of those natural disasters, but 60 to 70% will be generated by economic development and the chaotic development of land occupation. And this is a major factor behind risk increased. increases. So I'm not trying to wave those red flags too much, but we were talking about Saint Martin, the small territory, but the INSEE said that in the PACA region in France, 1 million inhabitants live in rainfall vulnerable regions in France, in metropolitan France. Where floods may occur. So if events actually increase, we're not talking about 30,000, but we're talking about the displacement of 1 million inhabitants that are highly and directly exposed to the intensification of that natural risk. And what can already be said here is that we should no longer have any doubts regarding the increased costs of those various events. When being questioned with the technological development, people ask us questions. Okay, the emergence of autonomous vehicles, and perhaps you won't have to cover anything in terms of insurance. New risks are going to be emerging. We need to mutualize things. We need to display more solidarity and mutual support. And property damage is quite spectacular when it comes to the needs in this respect. And as a result, we'll probably need to draw the consequences. We need, and here again, this is an essential and instrumental parameter in this model here. We need to be able to develop insurance and reassurance mechanisms, helping us to really have great control over that system. And we do model this, those events, and those events will become more intense and more frequent. And this is something we've been observing today, and hence are we going to be able to evaluate risks at an adequate level. Prefect, and well, I mean, you mentioned the issue related to those people living in totally exposed areas. I mean, this is a quasi-certainty. There are going to be important disasters and claims, and now given the limited area of those zones and the number of people at hand, we cannot just place people overnight. Now, hence the following question. In the next, 20 or 30 years down the line, will insurance companies be able to keep insuring those natural disasters? I really believe that we need to be poised for battle. And insurance, property coverage will be more expensive, and also will be influenced. We need to really take reinsurance costs into account and the frequency of those events. And number two, will be impacted. Why? Because they could be impacted or be depending on construction rules and the construction material. For example, cyclonic blinds do exist, but they're rarely implemented in those exposed regions. Mr. Gustin was talking about the fixation of roofs and over accidents this might generate. This will be a guarantee given by the insurance companies to collective authorities, local authorities and individuals. Why? Because they will have to, those people will have to comply with those rules, and will have to really make those people accountable. And proposals have been made by the Federation to the public authorities. Really are heading in this direction. In other words, populations need to be more accountable, as well as local authorities. Jean-Laurent Granier just referred to the estimation made by the profession here. I'm talking about the evolution of the cost of those natural disasters. But we've been following or observing the same thing in the whole world. And given the globalization, the extent of the globalization in the insurance sector, I'm talking about the French insurance companies, they'll be impacted in France as well as abroad. And you, as a prudential supervisor, how do you gauge the ability of French insurance companies in absorbing and those increased rates or claims? Well, I really highly appreciated the various presentations made here, because you were able to provide a human and social dimension to this to those natural disasters, and it's somewhat challenging to answer the Bertrand's question, because my approach will necessarily be cold and statistic based. But let's have a look at this issue and talk about global change and its impact on the frequency of natural disasters, or the intensity of the natural disasters. We really cannot but agree with you and say that the frequency of those natural disasters and their intensity will increase in forthcoming years, and we need to be poised for battle. When having a look at the statistical figures in the past decades, we probably did experience this phenomenon. And perhaps on a worldwide basis, it's not really that obvious, although in 2017 we experienced a record year in terms of natural catastrophe, which might be stemming from past global warming, and which might also be stemming from the accumulation of wealth in those areas at risk. And this is quite striking when observing the past decades and take stock of what happened now in 2017, which was a record year. We had figures which you already mentioned, but I'd like to get back to those because they're quite impressive. Economic damage reaching over $300 billion in a worldwide basis, and including 140 or 145 billion dollars of insured damage. 140 billion dollars. That's the cost incurred by insurance and reinsurance companies. And I would like to observe here, as an aside, it's quite interesting to have those statistical figures in mind. The United States. Donald Trump's United States, I mean, they're also jeopardized by this phenomena. With over 300 billion economic damage, and this is not all insured in the world now. 250, that's what the United States represents. In other words, over 4/5 or 5/6 of the damages recorded on a worldwide basis. And this figure is quite striking. A little over 1% of U.S. GDP, whereas our natural disasters in Europe only represent 1/10 of that 1%. In other words, 0.1% of European GDP.
This is just to say that it is of course a global phenomenon, yet some regions on the planet are more affected than others. And this is connected with the accumulation of wealth, as was mentioned earlier. This is the gist of the issue. Now, are French insurers sufficiently resilient in the face of the rising cost of natural disasters? Question mark. Now, to answer this question, we should really make a distinction between the risks and contingencies which we consider as insurable, like storms, ice, and these are limited by the market limits, and the French insurers and reinsurers have been the ones which have borne the cost of risk and which have set the prices and which have accepted or refuse to provide insurance coverage. But next to this, and Bertrand will not deny this, in France you have a public-private scheme for providing coverage to natural disasters, which has been in effect until today. But with respect to the magnitude of natural disasters it's been faced, it's worked okay so far. Now, on the with respect to the resilience of insurance companies, I mean, this is a different point because this private-public scheme providing coverage for natural disasters basically is a question of having the insurance companies transferring their liabilities to a state-backed organization. So you have a mechanism which protects the resilience of French insurance companies, which doesn't mean that this French natural disaster scheme will be able to withstand events of such a magnitude as the one we've had last year and this year. Otherwise, we'd have to change the parameters in the mechanism and equalize the burden of this disaster across the parties of the national communities, because the extra Nat Cat premium is basically covered by the French taxpayers, which cover the costs of contingencies covered in a number of regions, which are considered as high-risk concentration zones, and if there weren't this pooling of contingencies and risks and pooling of coverage, then the French market, would not be able to face up to it. Now, if I were to just look at the market-driven and market-regulated side of things, it can be said, we always have to be cautious, of course, when you state something like this, but it can be said that the French insurers are well equipped to address insurable, quote-unquote, natural disasters of an amplitude that is of magnitude of the ones which we have experienced, because the events which affected the insurance companies the most were the Maritime hurricane back in 1999. And this is a good point of reference, because back in 1999, we, I believe, reached the limits beyond which the French insurers would have gone bankrupt. But people learn and companies learn by experience. And after the Maritime hurricane, the French and the global insurance markets adapted and came up with more specific statistics, more precise models with higher reinsurance capabilities. And today, the industry might face up to disasters of greater magnitude than the Lothar and Martin hurricanes were back in 1999, which were some 6 billion euros in 27 euro equivalent. And extrapolating the inflation rate. Now, so much for the French market. Now, we have to be cautious in stating this, but I would say that French insurance companies show quite a degree of resilience, knowing that there will be development in the cost of these natural disasters. Now, with respect to the comparison with the international arena, the French insurance companies are very much globalized. A bit more, or 30% of their revenues are recorded outside of France. And you have two sides here. The French insurers have affiliates and subsidiaries operating across the world. So at the local level, these affiliates and subsidiaries have been affected by natural disasters. Here again, we would have to zoom in on statistics and details here at the local level, but there's no reason why there should be special worries with these large insurance transnational corporations, because the risks which are insured in local countries for amounts which can be weathered and absorbed by these large entities operating at the local level. So no major worries. And with respect to the reinsurers, be it ACPR when it operates in the market, or ASCOR, these reinsurance companies have underwritten NatCat risks and contingencies, and the reinsurance market have faced up to the record 2017 disasters and claims on the order of $240 billion and possibly more. Now, but this is not without limit as a model. So there will be a point when the insurance industry will not be able to face up. And if we weren't cautious enough in our forecasts, this would lead to some insurance companies going bust, or to some insurance companies not being able to cover more risks. So entire regions then would be in a situation where the insurance industry would not be able to face up to demand. Now, this is not an issue of emergency, but it is an issue for concern. Now, I would like to turn to the audience. If our technical team is up to task, I have a question to you as the audience. According to IPCC, rapid and extensive changes will be needed if climate change is to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Do you consider that the insurance industry is capable of such a revolution? So you have the choice between a yes answer, a no answer, and an I don't know answer. You were given remote devices, I think, for voting. Were you given these remote voting boxes? No, smartphone. Sorry. I'm lagging behind here. Technical revolution. So the results are here showed up on the screen. It's quite a stable, even, well-balanced results. A majority of votes went for a yes. Quite satisfactory, I would say, but you can see as the three categories of votes are well balanced that the issue of insuring natural disasters is not so obviously understood and tackled, which brings me to our third topic on our panel session, that is the issue of a coverage gap at the global level. It is considered that at the global level there are some 2/3 to 3/4 of economic damage generated by natural disasters which are not covered by insurance solutions. So, and not only in developing countries, but the case arises in the US and even in Europe. You have countries very close from here, like Germany and Italy, for a number of different reasons, which show a gap in insurance coverage, which is quite significant. Now, turning to you, Jean-Laurent, knowing that your group of companies generally operates in countries with a well-structured natural catastrophe insurance coverage scheme, like in the UK, and where you don't have the same framework in other countries like Germany. So how does Generali manage this situation and accommodates this issue of under insurance? As you mentioned, Bertrand, we have a situation of under coverage because at the global level, you said 3/4, 2/3 to 3/4. We consider that only 30% of contingencies and risks are covered. Now, there's no mandatory requirement of providing insurance in many countries. This is what we've observed in Europe. And the first comment as an insurer is that when you don't have a mandatory requirement, there's a risk of under coverage, that only those who perceive they are at risk due to their personal situations or due to past historical experience feel they are highly exposed. If you take the two primary countries next to France, that is Italy and Germany, to give you these examples, the home multi-peril penetration rate in Italy is about 30%. And so work has been done by FFA and the public powers and the industry players to provide a NatCat coverage, but it did not happen. So there were tax breaks given for NatCat coverage being contracted out, which means that coverage improved, but in Italy 400,000 risks, home residential risks, got protection. That is about 3% of the total market. So, and let me add that this is true for individuals, but not for commercial lines. Usually businesses take out insurance, taking into consideration the natural contingencies. Now, in our group, generally it's an avenue for improvement, which has been clearly identified, with a clear commitment to offer our Italian clients and customers an extensive flooding insurance coverage. And we came up with innovative insurance solutions, which were launched in 2017, and starting from property damage insurance to extend into earthquakes or flooding coverage, which are two natural disasters which people are most exposed to. So the pricing in such solutions is customized based on the location of the risk, so that you avoid the risk of under coverage, and also to depending on the type of coverage, and also depending on the excesses, because the excesses are solutions which are not very popular with the general public, but which are must-haves for the insurance companies, because basically it empowers the policyholders. So in Italy, where the Generali has extensive presence, we are reaching out to more coverage from the PNC coverage. In Germany, there's no NatCat coverage scheme. We are the second largest insurance company in Germany. No mandatory requirement, but Germany is a more mature market. That is, we have some 93% of homes in Germany which are covered by insurance contracts, including minimum storm insurance coverage. This is a special case of Germany, but we need to say that while 93% of risks and contingencies have storm coverage, only 20% of risks have earthquakes and flooding coverage. So there's a big gap. That is basically 7 million risks are covered for flooding and earthquakes. So for the 3 insurance companies which operate under the Generali brand, Generali Cosmos and Aram Burnell, operating in Germany, our policy has been to offer a minimum storm coverage for P&C contracts and to systematically offer a standardized and extended option of an opt-in extended coverage for flooding and earthquakes, knowing that it's not a mandatory requirement. Last point for Spain. State intervenes more massively with a consortium of a Spanish insurance company. I don't know whether you're aware of it. And this system makes it possible for the Spanish government and state to have control over the coverage of natural disasters, and solidarity and mutual support is organized and structured by the Spanish state, and the Spanish public opinion is quite attached to this system. So much for the European situation, but we need to keep in mind that it's desirable to have a scheme in place in France, which is organized by the market with backing from the state via ACPR association, because it avoids having under coverage, which is a key, especially when you have higher frequencies of natural disasters. And a company like Generali, when it operates in countries when the market is not organized, can offer solutions for individuals and companies who so desire. Yes, indeed, absolutely. To us, it is a key driver for increasing penetration with our clients. And it's an educational issue. Our network of agents are highly engaged. We have the most extensive European networks of tied agents. And so it's a question of educating our clients and customers to say that these opt-in guarantee coverages are extremely useful, not so optional, and a good must-have to cover the risk. Now, Bertrand, Delas, with respect to the disasters striking Saint-Martin and Saint-Barthélemy Islands, we realized there were other factors in addition to under-coverage. When you had policyholders who contracted out a nat cat coverage and who discovered that their coverage was not as extensive as they thought initially. Now, isn't there an issue there with respect to the way insurance products are distributed in those areas?
Yes, clearly. This is one of the priorities of every supervisory authority in Europe, to underscore consumer information, the duty of care and of counseling, and also what is under cover or not, and to what extent, in order to take into account the educational aspect mentioned by Jean-Laurent for every policyholder wherever they are, especially if these are areas deemed to be at risk. They must be aware when they take the responsibility of being uninsured to what they're exposed to. And this is educational aspect, is part of the risk culture, which was pointed out early on. It's true also that we have noted a number of cases, not only in the West Indies, business models in which the wholesale broker was the broker who works out the covers, sets the prices, selects risks, and then seeks a risk taker, which often is a bit blind. And this is something that we're attempting to limit, to tell you the truth, in the West Indies, but also in the building insurance in France. We've had a number of unfortunate matters where it would have been, and tomorrow will be very important, to underscore things more than we've done on the policyholders' responsibility and liability. And we have that Solvency II directive that gives us a leverage for that, so that the policyholder is, the insurer should audit and track the developments which are carried out for its distributors and carry out themselves a real supervision over their supervisors to make sure there's no difference in the approach between the risk-taking insurer and the distributor who presents that risk to the client. To end now this roundtable on the matter of the cover gap, Mr. Prefect, let's talk about the overseas French territory specificity. Less than half of the population was covered by an insurance contract, therefore we're not protected against 98% in France. So there's a real difference between these two territories. What could be made, what kind of reform should be undertaken to fill that protection gap in the French overseas territories? Look, it's a lot about educating people, but let's not go too much into education. There's some people that we won't be able to insure. At the end of the day, this is where the issue is. 40% of people were insured in Saint Martin. Some of them were badly insured. You mentioned this in a very diplomatic manner, Mr. Chair, because and I was seeing all the individual cases. I would send these texts that were sent to me to Renaud Stéphane, and very quickly we were able to see the reality between the bad ducks, as we call them, and the good ones, except what remains is an overall picture of a system. Well, you don't ask the policyholder who's not used to reading the small letters behind the contract, and how can you ask them to make the difference between a good insurer and a not so good insurer? I mean, the example comes from the top as well. The St. Martin's local authority was insured. It's an insurer that I will not name, for an amount of 15 million euros. That was the ceiling, and they got 220 million euros of claims. And they paid with the money of the taxpayer. They paid a consultant to make sure that what was written big, ceiling 15 million, was paid. I mean, there's some misuses, really. So today, the real challenge, what is the real challenge? First of all, use the insurance driver in order to create awareness among those who want to take out insurance that we cannot insure them against everything, anything, and under any condition. Concretely, we cannot say today, these are the debates we often have among ourselves, like today we cannot say to someone who built, legally, the permit, everything was fine, but somewhere in the past, when we would not materialize the risk in a very accurate manner, the way we do it now, it's difficult to tell these people, sir or madam, just go back again, rebuild in the same way, and we'll renew your insurance policy. There's one question which is key underlying all of this. Let's admit that we pressure that person and say, sir or madam, you are rebuilding, but you should be rebuilding by complying with the number of standards. And by the way, these standards that we should be able to build together, because winds at 375 kilometers per hour, does it mean that tomorrow we'll be building houses only with high-speed train windows? It's silly. Of course it's silly. We cannot close up people in bunkers around the year for a tornado or hurricane that will happen every so often only. So I have to think about the standards very seriously, but also think about the way one can accept, which is not an easy task. Some civilizations are good, especially in Polynesia, and so accept the occurrence of risk and accept the fact that their homes might disappear. And on the other hand, when the hurricane breaks out, or the hurricane, they can take shelter somewhere that is secure, because where I can wait and not do what happened at Saint Martin. Most people shut themselves up in their bathroom, in their restroom. So we need to put this in place. But sorry, there will be an issue then there will be coming up that all of this will generate an extra cost. With, on the other hand, the amount of the compensation when you are well insured, and on the other hand, the resilience of your building, who pays the difference? When you are a responsible owner, well, you say to yourself, look, I'll invest because 1 for 7 is worthwhile. But most people, and especially what we find with the inhabitants in Saint Martin, I think we're about 10% of owners who haven't expressed themselves in co-ownership. 13 months early on, don't even know that there are owners in Saint Martin. There was a connection with the good that has been diluted, and they have depreciated the house, and they don't care. So there's a real problem today. How you pay the difference, who pays for the difference, and then the other more cumbersome issue are what I call the empty teeth. We'll see in these homes, and we see this people who take a check out and they leave. And will leave homes or apartments deserted. And today, legally speaking, I don't know how to go about this. I don't know. I may take out a regulation on buildings, but if there's an apartment in the midst of an ownership, I mean, there are about 300 apartments in the biggest co-op. How do I go about this as a prefect or as a legal expert? So we'll have to make people responsible for those and to make sure that at least these people secure a common good, which is the co-op. So you see behind this, there are many, many small devils, and it's not over again. So we'll come back to these questions about prevention and rebuilding in the next topic. Now, to link this up with the next topic, so look, we've seen there are different situations in Europe between the UK, Spain, France, where there's a supportive organization about risk cover, and others where it's not the case. So it raises the question of finding out how couldn't we get a European system, and couldn't it be a way to express the interdependence among European peoples? There could be interesting development of the European construction. And by the way, hey, this here is a European conference. This takes us to the second interactive question, which is now, could Europe take steps to mutualize insurance against natural catastrophes? And here again, there is a choice between yes, no, or I don't know. Listen, the answer is very full of enthusiasm. Obviously, the public is very much pro-European and in favor of the European construction. Mr. Prefect, there's no insurance today that is European as such, but the awareness among European institutions of NatCats is real. Believe me. For Saint Martin, it's the European Union Solidarity Fund. For Irma and Maria, up to 49 million euros, which is not peanuts, which is there in order to repair all the goods and homes that are insurable. So you see, there's this first action of European interdependence and support, which shouldn't be overlooked. I mean, remember, the damage amounted to 220 million euros, so 49 million euro matters. Absolutely, says the chair. there were several white or green papers about the cover of gnatcats, and there are some European research projects such as the NIAID one, which are subsidized by the Commission, which aim at studying how one could use nature in order to lessen the effects of gnatcats. So I do confirm what you're saying. This topic is already well dealt with by the community. Talking now about prevention via natural methods, it leads me to think about the last topic concerning this roundtable, which is preventing natural risks. You have already broadly talked about this, Mr. Prefect, following the experience that you had in Saint Martin and Saint-Barthélemy in the West Indies. In addition to what you have already said, what strikes me is how difficult it is to take preventative steps just following a disaster. We may understand that people who are far away from the risk are not aware of the risk. It's difficult to convince them of the need to add protection, special standards that are more expensive, but just following a catastrophe, it's strange to see how difficult it is for people. You talked about institutional problems. Are there other difficulties that are arising that explain that fact? No, on the contrary. Look, I'm focusing on my territory, sorry for that. Look, I can feel whether it's in Guadeloupe or perhaps less in Saint Martin for cultural reasons, but at Saint-Barthélemy and Guadeloupe, at any rate, where there's small possibility after Irma and Maria, where we can talk about the culture of risk, the concept of Japanese days. I rely on this nowadays. I say, look at what happened. And if I let 2 or 3 years pass by and then, inshallah, no tornadoes, people would not listen to me. So I think, on the contrary, we have to go for it now, because people still remember the impact of the hurricanes and tornadoes, that we can work still about their mindsets and make sure that the system evolves. There's another key element, is to prepare oneself by improving the resilience of one's properties, but also you have to prepare yourself in your own mind. And frankly speaking, the Irma experience, and of Maria, by the way, was very healthy, very sound. We noticed, including when it came to civil servants who step in when they manage to manage a crisis. So when they're placed in a situation of acute crisis, and Irma and Maria were extremely acute crises, by the way, they lose common sense. And their only concern, and I'm not blaming them for that, their only concern is the fate of their families and themselves. So they're more concerned over the fate, the destiny of their family and friends than of the general interest. And it's a taboo. I've mentioned this already in many venues similar to this one. This is a taboo. Having said that, for people who are like me, who are prefects, who are supposed to be a pain in the neck, where you always have to predict the most awful things, hopefully not having to implement them. So we must prepare people at acting in highly deteriorated situations, and making sure that they stick to us. I do this work at every level, of course, with my close staff. I say this very clearly today. If you have the feeling, if there's a tornado such as Irma and Maria occurs, if you're fragile, mention it. It's better to say it now than in the midst of the crisis. It's important not to add the crisis to a crisis. And then I roll this out in the plans that we might have in schools, in corporations. I say, be careful when you put together a crisis unit. This is why my drills, my Japanese drills are interesting. We want to sort things out in these drills. It's not, you're not insulting people when you tell them, be careful. Are you really concerned? Look, let me mention extreme tangible cases. There were people in the case of Irma who were firemen who just had a newborn baby, and we may understand that an infant was born and that you're more concerned over the health of your infant and of your spouse than of the fate of the people whom you are supposed to save. I'm insisting on this point because it's very important. It's something new which has come out of the feedback one might get. It's not only important to prepare oneself, but also prepare the people who are supposed to step in order to protect and save the lives of the people who will be struck by this kind of NatCat. Thank you very much, Mr. Prefect. Bernard, I'm directing myself to you not as a prudential regulator. Do you believe that the risk preventative policies are an adequate answer to the issue of the insurability of NatCats, or shouldn't we prepare ourselves in the midterm, though, to leaving a number of territories and offshore economic activities and some homes? Prevention is not adequate enough, but it's absolutely necessary to start with. And this is what we've been saying during our discussion. There are three simultaneous approaches or successive approaches to what is insurable. It's the market, and the insurer have always, not only when guaranteeing the effects of NatCats, spur people to insure, and the relationship between the insurer and the reinsured is a strong incentive to make sure that there are preventive steps taken by the client, and this leads to the cover. Either the steps taken and the cover is improved, or it's the limited case that you mentioned, the insurer would guarantee only if the measures that are necessary are taken. If the cost of these steps is way out of the normal limits, the risk will not insure. And then there's the offshoring effect that you see. And there's a second sector, which is the public-private partnership. It's a French NatCat regime in there. Prevention is at the core of the business. When you have reached economic limits of the system, you need to introduce a demand for preventative measures. The local authorities, for example, have to implement this, but it can go all the way to banning building in certain places.
Troisième secteur. And you got a third sector, and this is what Mr. Gustin was saying. What is the state doing? Neither the private sector nor the insurable realm. Now, the state or public authorities should jump in and say or gauge what can be done, either on the basis of national solidarity and mutual support, or ban construction projects, and those interventions should be more numerous, stronger, and disturbing. But that's where one of the effects of those catnats, which he described, NatCats, which he described. Now, we can understand the role played by public authorities in the prevention of natural catastrophes. Now, for the private sector and insurers, the situation is perhaps not that simple. Generali, for example, is an insurance player. What can you do to encourage prevention and risk reduction and alleviation? Do you have any projects in this respect? As I was saying, in the old department example at Generali, we highly believe in having some sway on risk through prevention, and by perhaps focus on a partnership with insured people, and trying to really be, be pedagogical and advise them and try to explain why some areas are more vulnerable than other areas, and by really drawing up prevention schemes. We invested and we keep investing in research quite significantly. A little more than 1.5 years ago, hydrologists and climate experts and data scientists, actuaries got together and really identify what could be done and better so as to refine our risk analysis and the various recommendations, prevention-related recommendations, with very practical lists of items. We can actually develop our pricing as a result, so the price is not the same for risks depending on the profile of those risks. And some people are ready to buy those policies. Zoning was also reconsidered because we're now being more accurate in this respect, and we are drilling down when it comes to interactivity and the use of those data so as to adjust the various guarantees and our product's characteristics and drill down in the interaction with insurance holders. I was mentioning the partnership which we signed with the Prefect company, which is Météo France, Airbus Aerospatiale, and a specialized consortium affiliate, the construction consortium. And this partnership allows us to refine our analysis because we're working on a local level with very voluminous and important data. And this allows us to really work in real time when it comes to alert and awareness levels among our insurance holders. And this also makes it possible to be a lot more responsive, and we provided information to people in the old to make it possible to protect themselves more rapidly than the red alert. And we can also drill down in the pedagogical process, and at the end of the year we're going to be carrying out an event in October. We're in October, so we're going to be sending those alerts through text messages with a link which you can click, and there's going to be a scheme indicating or telling people what not to do and not to do. So this is not going to be a long message saying you should do this, this, or that. No, we're going to actually provide a graphic illustration of what has to be done, not to be done. Go up or go out or not go out, or take your car, not go take your car. We'll just cross out a car with a red cross, and really making it possible to people in panic, telling them what to do exactly. I believe in this type of scheme, and as an insurance person and the work we're doing on data, we got a genuine mission in this sector, and given the intensification of those risks, we really need to provide quite a number of innovative solutions in the market. And as far as this is concerned, this is a very important area for innovation and research in the future. The governor has joined us, and the microphone was cut off. And the governor is not responsible for this, I confirm. Jouzel, perhaps, conclusive remarks, perhaps enhanced awareness and the impact of global change and the impact of global change on the frequency and severity of natural disasters, awareness, which may be illustrated. Okay, this is really the end, said the speaker. So as to better manage risks, higher awareness among public authorities to develop prevention measures, risk prevention measures. Now, let's not be pessimistic. Can one say that, are we really up to snuff with all this? Not with respect to what is being done by each and everyone here, but with respect to the evolution and the acceleration, the pacing up of global change. Now, I don't know whether this works. So the figures I displayed, plus 1% of rainfall and associated with tornadoes, and the increase 10% of wind velocity, those figures are related to uncontrolled global change. Two other figures are quite important in uncontrolled global change. In Europe right now, we got approximately 5% of the Europeans who are now facing up to an extreme climate event, and in this case, in the second part of the century, this the ratio is going to be 2 Europeans out of 3. And when referring to the number of casualties, in other words, 2003 is now the right here, 15,000 casualties, 75,000 in Europe, an average in Europe, 3,000 casualties every year related to, or essentially related to heat waves, and this might be multiplied by 50. Now, to make a long story short, this world is a no-no. I mean, this is really the obvious message, and this was actually the purpose of the Paris Agreement. It was also the objective of the IPCC report, 1.5 point. This is what the report is actually recommending, or is actually producing. This report, the IPCC report, now the climate agreement without any figures in '92, Copenhagen and Paris agreements actually produced those figures with a maintenance or a cap of global change below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. Now, 2 degrees is actually 1 degree with respect to today, with respect to recent years. And questions have been put on the table. And the first question was, now, there is a global perception, global change of perception here. And the second question, is there a difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees? To be honest with you, I was not sure whether we were going to be showing that the report was going to be able to really be clear about it. It is clear. There are differences. Half a degree is important. I'm not going to dwell on in terms of extreme events. It does make a whole lot of difference. Heat waves and temperature records. Now, those increase twice as much as average temperature. If you want to go by 1.5 degrees, I mean, the record is 3 degrees in average. And this is 3 times at night. Now, the most intense, we're also mentioning the most intense ones, and we get back to what we already referred to, the ocean level increase, 10 centimeters more by the end of the century, and 10 million inhabitants will have to leave the place in which they dwell. We're also going to be referring to food security, food safety. I'm talking about soy, wheat, corn. Those are the main ingredients or products. I mean, of course, yield is going to go down, and the same thing with ocean resources. Biodiversity, basically, 2 degrees. I mean, no more corals. Perhaps you can save 10 to 30% at 1.5 degrees, and in any case, the reefs, well, the biodiversity loss is twice as more important at 2 degrees than 1.5 degrees. So there are differences between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. Now, basically, 3 degrees, this is where we're heading to with the Paris agreements as it is, and this is the best of all situations, 3.5 degrees, which really means that we really need to exert efforts, really remain below 2 degrees. And the countries, I mean, the small islands and vulnerable places in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans and the shores, those are vulnerable areas that advocated this and advocated the 1.5 degree level. This was no whim, and from the climate experts' point of view, this is a lot more. I mean, this is worth remaining below 1.5 degrees. And there was another important issue. This is what we were talking about. The adaptation cost was going to be less important than 1.5 degrees than 2 degrees. I mean, this is a given. No question about it. So the problem is to remain there. What does that mean, or what does that entail? This entails a change which was actually mentioned in the first question. This rapid, important change, we need to really engage in all of the sectors in all of the countries and among all the citizens of the planet. 1.5 degrees is divided by 2 are emissions between 2020 and 2030, and reach a break even by 2050 and be able to generate negative emissions. Now, this is quite an elegant term. In other words, actually pump in, store those emissions in the ground. Bioenergy, and combine bioenergy usage with a capture of CO2, direct capturing systems. Now, those solutions are mentioned in the IPCC report, but are not at all up and running today, far from that. And this is what we really need to do. 2 degrees, even below 2 degrees, it's quite difficult, dividing by 3 between 2020 and 2050. And CO2 break even, that's in the second part of the century, by 2075, is a little less stringent. But right now, we're heading to 3 degrees, 3.5 degrees. With respect to the Paris Agreement, now we're talking about 2 degrees here. 1/3 of the journey perhaps will have to be treaded, and 1/5 with respect to 1.5 degrees. So even though the Paris Agreement up to 2030 is complied with, or might be complied with, we're not really heading in the right direction. We're heading towards 3.5 degrees, hence the need to get back to the Paris Agreement ambition, hence the difficulty which is raised here in this ambition by the withdrawal of the United States. It's going to be very, very difficult to meet the challenge of the Paris Agreement if the U.S. Withdraw. They're the second withdrawing emitting country. One of the countries that did not ratify the agreement is Russia, and it is very unlikely for Russia to ratify the Paris Agreement if the U.S. Withdraws. And this is an eminently political issue. And from our standpoint, I believe that we still need to take this very seriously. This is what I'm trying to say here. We really need to really remain way below 2 degrees. 1.5 might be a little too challenging. And it does make sense to remain around 1.5. There is a sense around this. We can talk, we can acclimate ourselves to this. But at one point, the adaptation capacities are going to be more difficult. The 2-degree objective, that's the purpose here. It's a political choice. The idea according to which if you want to go stay below 2 degrees, we're going to be able to adjust ourselves. That's behind the whole objective. But if you want to go above 2 degrees, we have to be aware now. We have to be careful. Other aspects need to be taken into considerations with regions and populations that will not be able to adjust themselves below, way below 2 degrees. The global item is the increased inequalities. I believe that aged population. Rich populations are going to be able to find other areas, and poor populations are not going to be able to do so. And this is not really good for the development of our current civilizations. I don't want to ramble on too long, Bertrand. So beyond all the efforts that might be exerted at our level, this is to really guarantee the insurability and natural disaster prevention, we really need to be poised for battle and curb global warming way below, around 1.5 degrees, by 1.5 degrees, around 1.5 degrees and below 2 degrees. Well, thank you, everybody. Jouzel, Philippe, Gustin, Bertrand, Delas, Jean-Laurent, Granier, thank you very much for this panel and the quality of those various presentations.